And good morning, everybody. This is Grant from State of the Spark. Welcome to the show. Welcome to your life. This is episode, I think, 116. 116, and we're going to be talking about how manipulators use vulnerability in their favor and why we grow so darn cold because of that fact. We're going to be covering that. But of course, before that, my lovely, lovely friends, we've got other news. Good morning, Dylan Daniels. Thanks for the like. I appreciate that, sir. We've got other news. What does French wine taste like in space? We'll talk about it. And what's the latest research on where individual strength comes from? But before any of that, of course, you know, we're going to be covering a warm cup of gratitude. What are you grateful for this morning, my lovely friends? I want to hear in the comments what you are most grateful for. Because what's a day? What is a day if we do not go through that day reminding ourselves of the blessings of everything going in our favor? Of course, there's always challenges. Of course, the world will remind us of those soon enough, my friends. So before that, let's start our day symbolically by sharing what we're freaking grateful for. I'll start. What I'm grateful for this morning, two things. Number one, of course, I'm grateful for my awesome interview yesterday with Ryan Edrington. Good morning, Joe. Thank you so much for the like, sir. I hope you're doing great this morning. My awesome interview with Ryan Edrington yesterday. He is a veteran. He is a father. He's a husband. But we interviewed yesterday because he's also a powerful business owner. Lori Holland Cooper Smith says her family and friends, she's grateful for that. Sharing the love this morning. Lori, I hope you're doing fantastic out there. Lori is a bookkeeper. She's a dancer, and she's grateful this morning for her friends and family. I love it. But yes, I am grateful for this morning. My interview yesterday with Ryan, I got to hear his bold, and I say bold, vision for breaking $1 million this year, 7 figures. And the reason I say this is bold, and he and I talked about this in our video, you can see the replay down in my feed or on my YouTube or wherever, all over the place, or in the Facebook Goals and Gratitude group. Of course, you can see the replay there. We talked about at length why people are so afraid to talk about money. And so we talked a little bit about that. So I'm grateful for that. And of course, I'll tell you what else I'm grateful for. Tomorrow is somebody's birthday. And by somebody, I mean Marissa Facey Face Nadeau is having her lovely birthday. Sorry, my connectivity just went down. And it's back. Marissa's birthday is tomorrow. I believe she is 32 mañana. We met when I was 30, I think, 30. And we got married when I was 31. We've been married 10 years this year. And Marissa's birthday, I believe it's her 32nd birthday. I could stand corrected on that. But happy birthday to Marissa tomorrow, because you won't see us. Because tomorrow, Thursday and Friday, we're doing something special for Marissa's lovely, lovely birthday. So we won't see us Thursday, Friday. No show. I might pop in, but no show. But just so you know. So moving forward, that is a cup of gratitude. Let's talk about other news. Here we go. In other news, what does French space wine taste like? Yes, that is correct. I don't know if you guys know about Bordeaux or what goes on with Bordeaux. Oops, let's not do that. Boom. French space wine. Bordeaux is a type of wine, and oftentimes it goes through wild and woolly adventures to get the first tasting of Bordeaux French wine. Or Beaujolais kind of has these adventures, as my brother Heath used to tell me about. The latest adventures for Bordeaux wine is that there was a case of 12 bottles of Bordeaux sent to space for the last 12 months. It actually went up on a Northrop Grumman supply ship, and they will be doing a tasting of this wine. It just splashed down, I believe, in the Gulf of Mexico, if I'm not mistaken. Last year, 320 vine cuttings of Merlot. Boom. Opportunity, sobriety, and purpose. Someone else posted that. Sorry, let's jump back to gratitude. I want to make sure we catch that. Somebody posted Opportunity, sobriety, and purpose. That was Dylan Daniels. He actually commented that he is grateful for opportunity, sobriety, and purpose. And we had breakfast with Dylan a couple weeks back, and we had such a good time. So that is something to be grateful for this morning. So yes, this Bordeaux wine was in space 12 months, and it was part of an initiative of a group that's actually putting vines, actual vines, 320 cuttings into space to experiment how grapes and vines respond to being in space. So they did that. The wine splashed down, and they will be doing a tasting. So if you are a space nerd and a wine nerd, and if you're a space nerd, you should be both, because space is always better with wine. Here we go. Boom. There's the link to the article of the tasting coming up and some of the experiments they're running for agriculture. I mean, of course, they're putting up these cuttings of vines and how they do agriculture in space. And that's a big part of the dialogue right now. How will agriculture go in space? That remains to be seen. So you can check more out about that in other news about French space wine in the article there. Last but not least, in other news, I only have two pieces of other news this morning. Where does individual strength come from? And I think if you're paying attention at all, you know that the answer is hidden in the question itself. You see, in a piece of research, and this was an awesome abstract that I read this morning, and I super encourage it. Dr. John, I'm going to say his name wrong, Cacioppo. Dr. John Cacioppo, here's kind of his name. You can Google him. His research paper called Loneliness Matters, a theoretical and empirical review of consequences and mechanisms. Ooh, that is a mouthful. But if you read this, I researched this because I was looking at vulnerability. And we have this consciousness in our culture today that individual strengths comes from this solitary, rugged individualism. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And though, especially in a pioneering time and a pre-industrial age, that can get you through trying times. That is very true. It can get you through trying times. However, we are a social species, and we are more so every day. We're a social species more so every day. And that has led, and increasingly, especially as we move towards a new space age for our species and a new connected age of our species, we get more and more connected all the time. And that connectedness isn't just a codependence, it's unlocking new levels of individual strength. You see, in his paper, Dr. Cacioppo discovered that social isolation in general causes in our species a degree of hypervigilance. He has found that physiologically, multiple markers of physiological performance tank. They get worse and worse. Sleep gets worse, and people experience sleep deprivation. There's an increased morbidity and an increased mortality in the species in general. This is coming from a hypervigilance that comes from people who experience lower social connections. The inverse is true for those who had more stronger social connections. They had increased physiological markers, better sleep, decrease in morbidity and mortality. So the results are in from this study. We are individually stronger when we're not individual, when we're connected. Now, the difference between extroverts and introverts and how many connections do you need? This is an ongoing dialogue. I present for your consideration, extroverts probably have too many shallow connections. And I present for your consideration, introverts don't have enough at the excuse that they only have quality connections. I present for your consideration, both need to move towards a moderate, healthy amount of deeper connections to have higher increased individual strength. Let me give you this article here. I think it's a fantastic article, and it plays, good morning, Stephanie Cologne, thank you for the like this morning. It plays right into the message today about vulnerability. And I want to touch on vulnerability because as an extrovert, I am often assumed to be wielding vulnerability as a manipulation. And I want to call this out because, and not just the accusation of extroverts in general, but there is an increasing thickening and hardening of our hearts towards one another, because we truly have been manipulated, not just by extroverts, by all sorts of people who are using what I'm just terming pseudo vulnerability. So it's top of mind this morning as I was studying. Of course, I'm listening to Brené Brown. I hear all the recommendations flowing in. Yes, of course, I am listening to Brené Brown and her latest book, Dare to Lead. This is the second time I've gone through it because it's difficult content for me, because it feels like her vulnerability TED Talk, which I do recommend you watch, her vulnerability book, which I do recommend you read. But it glitches with me because it's almost like, oh, it's so kitsch to talk about vulnerability. So I am recognizing that I'm bothered by it. So I'm continuing to press into it. So I recommend you push into that. But I'd like to touch on this because she does say something. I've got a few notes here that I'm looking at and some notes over here that I want to bring up. And then I'm going to give you the 4 ways that I interpret how people manipulate and get vulnerability wrong. And I want to call this out because the net result should not be a particular lesson that Brené Brown talks about. She actually talks about how we get vulnerability wrong and the wrong lessons to learn from that. I want to touch on that. But real quick, the main thing she calls out that Dr. John Cacioppo from that research article I just pointed out, the thing that's important to take away here is the importance of interdependence. Now, if you've been a fan for a minute of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, you will know that every single year, if you followed me at all, you will know that I read 2 books every single year, cover to cover. Think and Grow Rich and 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Even though 7 Habits of Highly Effective People was made to lead towards his opus, The 8th Habit, which I love, 7 Habits is such a firm foundation. And in the intro article, he talks about the difference and basically the journey from dependence to independence, which is good. But what is great is interdependence. Brené Brown calls us out, as does Dr. John Cacioppo in that article from the National Institute of Health about interdependence and how we need to be able to be independent, not this rugged, staunch, me against the world individualism in our hearts. Though we often have that language with our teams, and though I do often encourage those sorts of relationships with your team of, hey, let's do this. It's us against the institution. It's us against the world. But it shouldn't be us against the people. It's okay to be us against the institutions, but I don't necessarily think it's good to be us against the people, because the people are the very ones we're trying to serve. And so Dr. John Cacioppo's work, Brené Brown's work, Stephen Covey's work, and hopefully my work with State of the Spark is encouraging a nation state. State of the Spark is not just a state. It's a nation state of a non-location nation of people who can be independent, but seek to be interdependent at that absolute next level. It's important. And let's talk about one other dynamic, and then we'll get into the 4. The last dynamic is this. Let us please differentiate the difference between systemic vulnerability. Is your business vulnerable? Is the system on how you manage your family vulnerable? Systemic vulnerability. Are those spaceships you're putting in space, are they systemically vulnerable? Is your business systemically vulnerable? Versus relational vulnerability. Honest exchange. If we are a brain as a species, vulnerability and vulnerable communications are the synaptic connections. And it's very important that that is flowing. You should drink lots of salts and you should consume healthy fats so that your brain connections move fluidly. Similarly, we should exercise relational, not systemic, relational vulnerability in order that the information, the fluid, the blood, the lifeblood of our species, information can flow smoothly, quickly, effectively. So if we can differentiate systemic from relational vulnerability, we have a huge start. So here are the 4 ways I have noticed people, introverts and extroverts, manipulate vulnerability. And I'll call this out, not so that we can learn the wrong lesson of, I'll never trust people again, or I'm going to limit who I trust. That's not going to be my approach. I'm going to have my one advice after these four. Number one, pseudo vulnerability. Vulnerability manipulators try to rescript the past. Oftentimes, you need your truth, and I need my truth about past events. But being vulnerable is allowing, true vulnerability is allowing other people's view to shape the lessons you're learning from your past. It allows other people who you trust, their view of past events to reshape yours, and together you triangulate past events. Pseudo vulnerability manipulators, they simply use an appearance of vulnerability to harden into their view of the world. False storylines that basically excuse them from better performance. Manipulators of pseudo vulnerability try to rescript the past to justify their present. And I suspect what they have an inkling of what their future will look like. And they're already teeing people up for their future failure by rescripting the past. But you can tell that this is being done when you bring up, well, I don't know if it happened that way. And they harden into it, as opposed to a true vulnerability would go, tell me more about how you saw those past events playing out, or something to that effect. So the first way manipulators use vulnerability is they make it seem like, oh no, man, this is how it was for me. There's some victimhood, there's some blame, but they harden into it. So they wield their vulnerability. And you don't want to stomp on someone's past. There's a tenderness to someone's story. And when someone goes, no, this is my truth, man, this is my past, and there's a defensiveness to it. I don't believe that's true vulnerability. I believe rescripting the past and using vulnerability to back people off from challenging that past, I believe, is how manipulators wield vulnerability. Number two, how manipulators wield vulnerability to manipulate. Continuous victimhood. If you could see that rescripting the past is this tendency to reinforce their own victimhood. Now, this should be the most obvious way someone wields. This is the absolute most obvious way manipulators use vulnerability to protect themselves. So narcissists, they always feel like others are holding them down, or even if they don't feel that way, they often purport that. When confronted, they're saying, I'm just being vulnerable here. Manipulators use pseudo vulnerability to make excuse for always being the victim. Hey, I need you to perform here. Well, you're always beating me up. Why are you always writing me? Oh my God, that's so exhausting from an employee. Or with a spouse, you have to have a healthy, safe space with a spouse to challenge one another. But if someone's not just mentally exhausted, but they are continuously playing the victim, you're always beating me up, you're always picking at me, there's a resistance and a refusal to personally grow and personally develop there. It's another way manipulators wield pseudo vulnerability. They move to the victim chair as quickly as possible, and it's always their go-to. Now, again, someone could authentically be just mentally and psychologically tapped. In those cases, they might just say, I feel like you're always attacking me. You got to know the nuance. The only way to know the difference is to be in relationship and rapport with those people. But you know the difference when someone jumps to the victim chair in order to back you off from challenging each other to be better. You can tell that a manipulator is using pseudo vulnerability when they always jump to the victim chair. Number three, diminishing worth of others or even themselves. I'm just being honest. I'm just being vulnerable. Oftentimes, a manipulator will wield the perception of, I'd like to be vulnerable with you, and then critique you. But they also can direct this to themselves. I'm going to just be vulnerable here, and I'm the worst. You know, there's a tool in negotiations from Never Split the Difference, great book. There's a tool in negotiations called accusation audit. And an accusation audit basically says, listen, I know that you're going to think that I'm being mean here. And when you audit that preemptively, and then you say what you need to say, oftentimes psychologically, people don't want to be this bad person. Hey, you're going to think I'm horrible. No one wants to be the person that thinks you're horrible. Hey, you're going to think I'm the worst. I don't want to be the person who thinks you're the worst. And then you say whatever it is you're trying to say. That's a negotiating tactic. And in negotiations, coming from a sincere place to de-escalate a situation, if the motive's right, it can be very useful and very effective. But you can easily cross the line into manipulation when you say things along the line of, hey, I'm just being vulnerable, but you're whatever. I'm just being vulnerable, but I'm the worst. Either way, it can turn into a manipulation and checkmate the other person from saying what they need to say to prevent them from responding. So basically, it's you trying to get carte blanche criticism in. You're diminishing others' worth. So you're wielding vulnerability as a weapon, as a checkmate to prevent them from saying anything. And you suddenly can say whatever you want, diminishing worth of them or even diminishing worth of yourself. It can be self-destructive or others destructive. It's in the guise of being honest or vulnerable, but then it's often followed by a crushing criticism that no one can respond to because you have the moral high ground of coming from a place of vulnerability. So number one, rescripting the past. Number two, continuous victimhood. Number three, diminishing the worth of others or themselves. And last but not least, and I wouldn't say this is any greater than the others, but it's equally destructive, and that is deflecting. Deflecting is blaming others in the guise of disempowering themselves. Now, this one's super nuanced. Someone is to blame for something, but then they pull in the vulnerability card. Well, I'd like to be vulnerable about this, but I'm feeling attacked. And really, I was just trying to do this, this, and this. And Stacy is the one who then did X, Y, and Z, which is what made this thing wrong. They took the moral high ground of vulnerability. Oh, I really tried. They reframed. Basically, what a manipulator will do in this moment is they run almost to the victim chair, but they retreat into vulnerability. I'm being vulnerable, so you can't attack me. And you're like, okay. Then they reframe the motive. This is what I was trying to do. And then when I handed it off to so-and-so, they did X. Deflecting is oftentimes what manipulators do and wield vulnerability as a home base so that psychologically you listen to the excuses as they deflect and blame someone else. These are some of the four big ways as I was taking a mental inventory of how I've been manipulated in the past, how I've seen people manipulated in the past, and specifically using vulnerability as almost a protective shield, a guise, a mask of vulnerability. This is what I think, this is my advice about this. People do this all the time. And if you analyze any one of these, there are situations where any one of these four places are actual legitimate vulnerabilities. If someone can talk about their past, listen, in my past, how I experienced it was X, Y, and Z. And there is a sincere vulnerability about how someone observed their past. There should be an openness to reshape that, or for that to be reshaped, or the story to be reshaped, especially if someone is sincerely, vulnerably seeking healing. They should be open to new inputs. Continuous victimhood. There are moments where someone's being vulnerable and sincerely saying, listen, I'm really feeling attacked here. But they don't do it all the time. A diminishing worth. It's very rare that a sincere person being sincerely vulnerable will intentionally diminish someone else's worth, but they could be vulnerable and be like, hey, I'm being honest. I don't think I'm worth much. If I were being honest, I wouldn't think what you're bringing to the table is worth much. There are some honest, sincere moments, but again, there's got to be a lot of rapport and relationship in place. And deflecting, there might be real scenarios where, listen, that really isn't my fault. I'm feeling attacked here, and I feel like you attack me quite frequently. You could see that there's nuance to vulnerability. But people have wielded it so much and so frequently, vulnerability, to our manipulation that we grow tired, we grow a hard skin, and we learn the wrong lesson. And the wrong lesson is this. I will never trust again. I will never be vulnerable again. Listen, that is the wrong lesson to learn from a social hybrid species. We are a colony species. We are a social species. And to learn to take our antenna that connect us to the species and take them off and break them off so that we don't connect deeply and vulnerably with others at the risk of seeming like we're manipulating or to prevent them from manipulating us, that is not the lesson to learn. I think the lesson to learn in Spark language is to tune in your bullshit meter. The more authentic you are, the quicker you'll be able to call out, hey, listen, I know that you're talking about being vulnerable, but I really am getting the sense that you're manipulating with that. How do I know you're being sincerely vulnerable? And reframe the conversation. Having an honest conversation. Listen, how do they tell counterfeit money? How do they teach bankers to tell counterfeit money? They make them touch a ton of the real. And as soon as they touch fake money, they pause and second take it. The best way to tell if someone is wielding vulnerability to a manipulation is for you to wield authentic vulnerability as often as reasonable, starting with trusting relationships. Now, again, there's some assumptions here. You have trusting relationships. You have rapport with the people you're talking with. You're not talking about systemic vulnerability. You're talking about individual and interpersonal vulnerability. But the more you practice it, the more you'll be equipped. I think Brene Brown uses the language about armor. We all learn to put on this armor to protect ourselves from other people. And she encourages us to put down the armor. Because if you can wield vulnerability, you'll be invulnerable to manipulative vulnerability. Hear me again on that. If you learn to authentically wield vulnerability, you'll be invulnerable to manipulative vulnerability. Listen, I'm going to go about my morning. I just wanted to drop my current learnings on you on what I'm studying about vulnerability. I hope you can make use of that. I hope it's useful. I hope you learned something. I hope the main thing you learned today is to go out there and continually wear your heart on your sleeve. Go out there and be bold. Go out there and be authentic and put that out there in every negative, because you will experience negative encounters. I'm not telling you this will prevent you from negative encounters. I'm telling you, you will have more of them where people will glitch and you won't be part of that group, but you will slowly learn your real group. You will slowly develop your real friends. I tell you this because you should be out there today encountering people, making yourself available to others, and I guarantee you will attract the right people. So those are just my learning today in vulnerability. I hope you have a phenomenal day. I hope you encounter greatness today. I hope you encounter good people today. Remember, no show Thursday and Friday. I'll do a post on it so that everyone remembers. But for now, remember the mission: igniting lives of explosive significance, starting with your own. Have a great day.